Governor-General Sam Mostyn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Emma. It's great to be here.
We are very excited to be talking with you today, and we'll start with a really simple but broad one, I suppose. Mm-hmm. What is the role of the Governor-General? What do you do?
Well, thank you for asking that question. A lot of people meet me in many different walks of life now, and they say, it's nice to see you, but who are you and what do you do? So I like to think of the Governor-General having 4 C's that define the ambit of the role. And it's really simple. I have constitutional roles, I have ceremonial functions, community obligations and community interaction, and I'm Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Defence Force. Mm-hmm. The how I came to be here and what a Governor-General is all a function of our wonderful, stable, incredible democracy. We have a constitution that governs how our parliamentary system operates. So I'm effectively a part of the parliament. I am appointed by the monarch, King Charles, but I'm chosen by the Australian Prime Minister, as all Australian Governors-General have been before. And then I carry all of the constitutional functions that are held by the head of state, who is the King. And so I'm not the Australian head of state. I represent the Australian head of state. And an important feature that I think many people miss is that the King and the Queen before him would never contact an Australian Governor-General to suggest how we should do anything or offer an advice or direction. Okay. And a Governor-General would never contact the palace and speak to the King or the monarch's team to ask for advice in relation to anything that I administer under our constitution. And so I take my advice and counsel from the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and I work with the government and the Parliament. And so we have a historical connection to the monarch, but that has no bearing on the way in which I conduct myself in the role.
Okay, so given all of that, it sounds like a pretty unique job. How do you know you're doing a good job? And if it's not Charles, who is your boss?
That's such a good question, because I think generally I've been appointed by someone who under the Constitution is the head of state. And theoretically, I guess you could say that would make him my boss. But in the way I think about it, and I think Australians would expect me to think about it, I think of the Australian public, that all Australians are my boss. And so how do I know how I'm doing a good job? One will be that more Australians understand A, why we have a Governor-General and what the purpose of the role is, and B, could actually describe how our constitutional system operates and would be able to tell you why our democracy works and at least give you the basics of our civics. If I could judge over the next few years or see that more Australians were interested in how our democracy actually works and showed up as active, curious, animated citizens, then I think I'm doing a very good job on that part of the role. More generally, I have to do a good role for Australians in showing up and representing the best of Australian values when it comes to the ceremonial parts of my job, and turning up in community all around the country to listen to what it is that Australians can tell someone who has no politics but could talk to government about things that I get to see from my angle that maybe others in the system don't.
I want to speak a little more about the constitutional and legislative responsibilities of your role. Firstly, can you tell us a little bit about royal assent, how that all works?
Yes. So for any legislation that is raised in the Parliament and has gone through both houses of the Parliament, that is put into the bill form. It's signed by the clerk of the Senate and then is sent to me to give the royal assent. So I'm always very conscious that when I open those bills and as I'm signing, I always think about the fact that in this moment, in giving that assent, I'm giving effect to the will of the Australian people, and this bill now becomes the law. I can't read the bill and say, actually, I have some questions or I'd like to debate aspects of this. My personal, anything I might think about the matter, any understanding of that matter is completely irrelevant at that moment. It's my job to fulfil the ultimate final step of the people's elected representatives passing laws that then need the assent under the Constitution.
What happens when or if legislation comes across your desk that does conflict with your values? I understand it's an apolitical role, but you have throughout your career in the private sector championed the cause of various communities, of social justice issues. So how do you reconcile that part of yourself with this job?
Very easily, and I wouldn't have accepted the job if I didn't understand the very, very specific obligations. When I was sworn in as Australia's Governor-General in the Senate almost a year ago, I swore an oath to the King and I swore an oath to the Australian people about how I would conduct myself in the role, and that is with total impartiality and no politics. No Governor-General would ever tamper with a constitutional responsibility that is so clear. I'm in that unique position where I have no politics, I have no policies, I have no money to administer. I represent ultimately what will be the will of all Australian people when they vote. All I do is give effect to things that Australians want to have happen. And my personal views really are not just irrelevant, they're completely inappropriate when it comes to the administration of our government.
So in the context of government, you are the representative of the Constitution. You're kind of the expert of all things constitutional, and it's your job to uphold every part of that.
So the Crown's powers are dealt with in the Constitution, and the power of the Governor-General to represent the head of state. Given all of that, some would say, well, the King must call occasionally and say, I think you could do it this way, or I've noticed this is happening in your Constitution. He would never do that. And I would never call his office to say, I'm looking for guidance.
Okay.
And so the person I would speak to if I wanted to discuss things would be the Prime Minister, a senior cabinet minister, or my staff, the Office of the Official Secretary. I think of it as almost like an entirely hermetically sealed Australian way of operating, but we draw my power from the head of state in the Constitution, the King.
How would you answer a question from someone who might ask, well, what's the point? Why does that matter for the legislative process?
What we have, I think, in this country, it's a story that starts with 65,000 years of attachment to this continent and First Nations law, language, culture, eldership, always offered generously to those that have come subsequently. And we've come through 50 or 60 years of the most remarkable multiculturalism and arrival of over 8 million people to this country who bring a promise when they become Australian citizens to give effect to the laws of this country and to give their allegiance to Australia and Australians. And if you put all those things together and you ask what's holding the whole thing together so that we can continue to grow and be dynamic, I think it's the fact that we have this solid democracy with a Westminster system that's linked to the Crown in a way that gives stability and continuity, but does not determine how we deal with that in this country. Our Constitution at the time of Federation was drafted in a creative way to give the power to the people to always amend it. Should a government and opposition of a day sense that the Australian public has an issue they would like to be asked about that they could then vote on. And we've had many of those, most do not succeed. And I've been reflecting on the fact that the stability that comes from that system, the problem isn't with the Crown, it's that we've become a very complacent country with a lack of attention to detail on civics. So when questions are asked of us as a nation, if you don't know that we have a constitution, if you don't know the role of the Governor-General and its relationship with the Prime Minister and the Parliament, and you're not encouraged to have a civics view and think about yourself as a citizen with a sense of agency, then why would you show up and actually do the work to change the Constitution? So I see the problem not being in our constitutional framework. The problem is in our lack of understanding of the basic civics that give us the power as citizens to exercise that right and to change things should the country want to.
In building on that civics and, what you speak to there is so important to what we're trying to do here on, a much smaller scale with what the Daily Aus means.
Well, thank you. I want to say the reason I'm so delighted to chat with you, Emma, and for your audience is that you're not doing a little thing. What you're involved in is what I think is fundamental to our success as a nation, because I get this incredible kaleidoscopic view of the country and then I get to see it at fine grain when I go and visit communities and talk to people and I see the problem of the civics question. And so what you're doing in unpacking it and giving people a sense of their own agency is really important.
Thank you.
Because you're dispelling a whole lot of misunderstanding, but you're pushing up against misinformation and disinformation on this front.
I'm interested in unpacking maybe those misconceptions around your relationship with the royal family specifically. What does your role mean acting as a representative for the monarch? Is that different to acting for the royal family? I think a lot of people do imagine that you might be emailing each other or sending off a WhatsApp message here and there.
So I like the way that you made the distinction between the Crown and royalty. I exercise the powers of the Crown through the Constitution in Australia as an Australian chosen by an Australian. I have a relationship with His Majesty as he appointed me. I went to visit him in Buckingham Palace in the months before I was appointed, and we sat to get to know one another. We had just under an hour together, and he didn't tell me how to do my job. He didn't ask me what my agenda would be, because he knows that my job in large part is to do exactly as the Constitution says. But he asked me how Australia was going. What was I seeing? What was I most proud of as an Australian? Mm-hmm. He asked me about my daughter and how she was going. It was both very important and also very just person to person, getting to know someone. Mm. I said, would you like me to occasionally write to you just to let you know things that are happening in Australia? He said, well, that would be very good, and I will occasionally write to you to let you know what's happening here. When he came to Australia with Her Majesty in October last year, and I hosted with Simeon a royal visit, Australians have an affinity and I think some affection for the royal family, and a royal visit is always generally well received. Those that are not happy make that known and either ignore the whole thing or protest, and that's one of the great things about our democracy, that can happen. Of course, whilst he was here, he was the head of state, and so I moved out of Admiralty House while he and the Queen stayed there, because that's the place where the Governor-General or the head of state will stay, and it would be not appropriate for us just to be in the house, chatting and
sharing Netflix logins.
That's it. Well, actually, you might share a login, but not share a kind of conversation on a difficult constitutional issue I might have in the back of my mind, or a thing that's facing Australia that I think he should guide me on. So that separation is really important. There's a deep respect for one another. Mm-hmm. There's a deep understanding of what each other's roles are. Mm-hmm. And then he was really intrigued and interested in the successful parts of the country that we were showing him and letting people come and tell him about as part of the story of how Australia's going.
How do you balance representing the Crown and representing modern Australia, modern Australian values? What does that balance look like?
When the Prime Minister said he wanted me to be a modern, visible and optimistic Governor-General, in accepting the role, I had to think, well, what does modernity for the Australian Governor-General actually mean? How do I show that? And in part, that's where I came to the view that I would commit myself to care, kindness and respect as the centrepiece of how I would do the job. What is care in a modern, successful, complex society? How do you show that? And I'm taking my lead now from Australians wherever I go, and I ask them, what does care mean for you? Does it show up physically in the middle of a terrible natural disaster? Or is it the way we treat each other when someone is doing it tough? Or do we do it through our mental health system? Do we do it by just showing how we respect one another by not excluding? The great opportunity and gift I've been given in this role is to show, in representing the head of state, that everyone can belong in this country. Honestly, Emma, I'm overwhelmed with people's level of enthusiasm and interest when they see that someone in a high public office is happy to ask those questions and say, is that actually what an Australian value is? Is that the muscle we could be exercising about caring for one another? And so I think care and kindness, respect, exercising that muscle are now what I think are some of the great Australian values.
With those values in mind and, prioritising care and respect and what that means to you, inevitably a role of the Crown, representing the Crown, means inevitable links to colonialism and all that symbolises. How do you reconcile that with Australia's First Nations history, and how does that play into your approach as Governor-General?
Well, I guess it comes back to my philosophy that everyone belongs. So I have had a long association with many First Nations people, and I served on the board of Reconciliation Australia. I had to imagine what would my conversations be with First Nations Australians about why I would say yes, without being able to ask them at the time. But once I had announced, I reached out to all sorts of people, and it was so generous that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people said, of course you should say yes, of course you should do this job, but do it with the greatest of respect to our story. But our story isn't your story. Create spaces of respect and generosity and belonging where we continue to tell our stories. So that's what I do. I try to create an environment where we constantly look to the strength that we have uniquely because of where we started. And I don't think any of us really ever want to not acknowledge the history of what happened through colonisation. I'm disappointed that as I was growing up, in the 60s and 70s. I didn't have any history. I had no knowledge of that part of Australia. Whereas my 25-year-old daughter today, her entire curriculum had so much of that storytelling and engagement. So I think it comes down to respect. Respect First Nations people for whom the Crown is a real problem. I respect First Nations people for whom Australia Day is a problem. I would always acknowledge that for many that's a day of mourning. In fact, in 1938, that was the date chosen by the Aboriginal League to deal with mourning. And so I'm trying to be as expansive, inclusive, respectful, but understanding the role I represent for some provides a tension. And I will always open that conversation up to explain my role in this, but my sense of deep respect always for First Nations people and our history.
Do you see the role as having shifted in the wake of the Voice referendum? Has anything changed since that failure?
We know that for many communities, Aboriginal communities, there was a very high rate of support. What I think has changed for my role, though, is the way in which compassion is shown. I often visit those communities, and I think just showing up, understanding some grief and pain. I don't enter into the discussion about the why or how. I simply am there, as Sir Zelman Cowan used to say, to reflect the light and shade of what's occurring in communities back to the Australian people. When I met all of the living Governors-General before I was sworn in, and then Sir William Dean said to me, just always act with compassion. Just show up with compassion. Don't dismiss anybody. And that's one of the great powers of this office, is to show up, to sit compassionately and listen. Where appropriate, reflect some of this light and shade.
Given some of the complexities that we have discussed, what does the future of the role of the monarchy look like for Australians?
The matter of the Republic has been put to the Australian public before, and it was not successful. Australians did not vote for it. And in my role, I am only concerned with what the will of the people does in showing up to those moments of big constitutional consequence. And I think what we're seeing is a modern king who is engaging on issues many Australians share a view on. But when people who serve turn up and show that they are good people with compassion, Australians seem to respond very well.
There was maybe a sentiment that when Queen Elizabeth passed away, the conversation would be reignited. But it hasn't really, has it?
No. If anything, I think a modern king doing what he's doing and a failure of civics with us leaves this big gap, this chasm. If the only question we ever ask ourselves is our relationship to the king, as opposed to what is the Constitution, how is Australia governed, how does my vote count? That's my bigger concern, that if we just keep looking at monarchy and royalty as some kind of proxy for a relationship that doesn't actually tell us, never tells me what to do, then maybe we're asking the wrong question about where we are as a country. I have no stake in that, in that decision about where the Australian people go. I do have a really big stake, though, in helping Australians be proud of their civic life and spending a bit of time reflecting on why do I not care? Why do I not know what the Governor-General does? And why is it easier for me to knock it or knock the person in the office than it is to ask myself the question of, hang on, how does that work? Oh, is that why I have a compulsory vote? And I think particularly for people you're speaking to, younger Australians, 25,000 children come through Government House every year. At grade 6, half of those kids understand our civics, generally. By the time they get to end of year 10, it's dropped to under 25%. So something's happening when those kids come through who are enthusiastic, and then knowing that by the time they get to year 10, who cares? And then as they get to be adults, who cares even less? And then we start throwing things around and criticising. Then we're in division and misinformation and disinformation, and no one knows how to interpret what's real anymore. So I go back to, how do you grab hold of what I see in those 25,000 children through your audience and beyond, to say, it is magic when you see a young person who knows what our system is, and it's equally really upsetting when I meet people who have given up caring. And so my job, I think, is to keep showing up and saying, no matter what you might think before asking the question, I'm here to help build, together with as many Australians as I can find, a story about our civics and how we want to cherish it and how it's incredibly rare.
I'm really interested in your extensive experience in the private sector as a woman who has been a pioneer in many fields, in many different positions. I believe when you were first appointed the first female AFL commissioner, you were described as a quota pick. There's a lot of conversation going on at the moment about quotas. The opposition leader, Susan Lee, just last week said she doesn't really care if we have quotas. She just wants more women in the Liberal Party. So with all of this conversation going on and your experience, what is your stance on quotas? What's your position?
If I look back to the AFL days, the fastest growing membership of clubs and the people who held up the AFL system financially supporting were women. At least half the fans were women, and women were all over this game, including what came subsequently, which was actually playing. And so the president of the AFL went to 10 women. We went through the most incredible series of interviews. I got down to shorter and shorter lists until the last two of us were there, and then finally I was the fortunate person to be appointed. And then it started. It's woke, it's gender, it wasn't merit. Many people wrote, she lacks merit, this is simply a quota, and this is what you end up with, some flunky who, isn't one of us, one of the men. My response to it at the time, in the same way I would say about my current appointment, is look at how we got here. So the men on the commission before I was appointed were never put through a recruitment process. They were never interviewed. They never had referees. So yes, it was exclusive to a group of 10 women to then provide our credentials. And from time since, now there are 4 women on that commission. Every appointment to the commission is done through a process where there is an interview process, nominations, referees. It didn't happen before that. So sometimes we fix imbalances and inequalities by having to break the system, but do it in a way that is all about merit. The whole thing about that process was it was the first merit-based appointment, because we had to be tested against one another. So I'm the second only in this role as a woman, and in accepting this role, I knew that there would be a torrent of that kind of, ranging from abuse to just their own anger, that quotas and system had gone too far and men didn't count anymore. I expected all of that. But I wanted to accept the role having been asked. There was no doubt in my mind that the Prime Minister, in appointing a woman, was reflecting on the fact that there had only been one other, and I'm number 28. Whether you call that a quota or not, he, I think, was reflecting the fact that we had to stop telling the country that only men could do this job. So I had to reconcile that it wasn't a quota, that it was the most natural thing for a leader to do, to say, I want to make sure Australians see that no gender gets this above the other. If we have inequity and we can fix it, that's what we do. It's the way in which you deal with the quota and how you explain it and how you show the benefit to men. I have never liked serving on a board of all women, because no group of homogenous people with the same experience ever make the kind of good decisions that a group of people with different experiences can make. But hoping, wishing and praying for equality for anyone has never worked. You have to set yourself a target. You've got to measure yourself against it. You've got to have the best people available. And we have to show that it's not a zero-sum game for those that think they've lost out.
Sam Mostyn, I could talk to you all day, but I have one final question before we let you go. Thank you for being so generous with your time. We are speaking essentially on the anniversary of your appointment to this role, almost to the day 1 year ago that you became Governor-General of Australia. We do something here at TDA on staff birthdays where we ask each other to share something that we know now that we didn't know a year ago. So I thought, in the spirit of your GG birthday, what do you know now that you didn't know a year ago?
I think what I know now is that we are a much bigger, better, united nation as Australia than I ever contemplated when I started. I was more thinking about the things that were holding us back. And I now get to see, whether it's the panoramic view or the fine grain, wherever I go, I see something about this country that is truly astonishing. And it doesn't just make me sort of the number one fan of Australia, although I think I have become that. I am constantly thrilled and delighted, not amazed, but absolutely, and confirmed in the view that we are so much stronger. We're in a better place than we let ourselves understand. And I don't mean to be nationalistic, or it's just we are extraordinary. And I hadn't let myself really think about that coming into this role. And the last thing I've realised is that it's okay for us to start telling stories back to ourselves that are the positive ones. We do not have to crowd ourselves always with what might still divide us or cause us to be at odds. We need to keep telling ourselves a much bigger, better, mighty story and lock into that and then do the work.